Okay, thank you. Okay. So I think the previous room just closed, so we're waiting maybe for a minute or so. Let me share my screen. Okay. Okay, hi, welcome everyone. Welcome to the climate change panel. So I think just a brief run through of the housekeeping rules before we begin again. So yeah, please mute your mic unless otherwise stated. Do note that the webinar will be recorded and we'll have a Q&A function. So please submit your Q&A functions under the Q&A button. Do submit the questions to the panel anytime during the webinar and indicate the panelist name if you'd like to address a question to a specific panelist. And please do upvote the questions you'd like to be answered first. You can find the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen here. And if you want to chat, please use the chat box to participate in discussion. You can discuss about anything that the panelists said, but please do remember to change to toggle your chat settings from all panelists to all panelists and attendees so that everyone can see the discussion. Last but not least, for contingency issues, if the current speaker has technical issues, the room will wait a minute for the present speaker to reconnect. If the speaker is unable to reconnect, we will proceed on with the panel first. If Zoom itself has issues, I think it'll be quite hard to arrange a second meeting again, but the social impact will still go on. Last but not least, please do not be afraid to contact me or Daphne if you're having any issues. And sit back and enjoy and do participate in the panel. So for today, we have a great lineup of panelists. Let me introduce them one by one. So Dr. To is a marine biologist who focuses on marine conservation and reef restoration. He's currently a lecturer with CAP in NUS, where he teaches interdisciplinary modules on environmental conservation and sustainability. He's also the co-founder of Our Singapore Reefs and a council member of the Singapore Institute of Biology. His research focuses on coral reef conservation and restoration, aquaculture, bioeconomics, and coral biology. Dr. To has also worked extensively in Singapore to assist in environmental impact assessments, public consultation exercises, execution of mitigation measures, and environmental monitoring. Next, we have Assistant Professor Marvin. Assistant Professor Marvin is a professor at UNS College's Environmental Studies faculty. Prior to his PhD, he did graduate work in environmental engineering at NUS. Prof. Montefiore also has a broad professional background, having practiced engineering, management, consulting and policy work in the Philippines, Singapore, and United States. He has been an environmental scholar and professional for more than 20 years. Next, we have Melissa Lowe from the who is a research fellow at the Energy Studies Institute. She has participated in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, so it's quite long, conference of parties for over a decade and is an active sustainability thought leader. She's NUS designated contact point for NUS's accreditation to the UNFCCC and serves on the 9-member steering committee of research and independent non-governmental organization under the UNFCCC. Melissa provides policy analysis and conducts workshops for various stakeholders to improve their understanding of the implications of the Paris Agreement. Her current research focuses on the transparency of climate action and support reporting in Southeast Asia. Melissa is also an active contributor on CNA. Next up, we have Dr. Joelle Lai. Dr. Joelle Lai is a senior lecturer at NUS. Her research interest revolves around crabs and other marine biogeography using crustacean models. She's also a museum officer at the Lee Kuan Yew National History Museum, in which she leads public outreach, education, and volunteer management. She has organized field trips for students to understand Singapore's green and brown footprint, as well as the impact of marine debris on Singapore's coastline. Last but not least, we have Noor Lastrina Hamid, who is the co-founder of the Singapore Youth for Climate Action. She's primarily interested in how climate issues and how people respond to climate impacts. She delivered a speech at the Paris 2015 UN Climate Change Conference, calling for all nations to adopt a legally binding agreement to keep the global temperature increase below 1.5 degrees. She's a recipient of the NEA Eco-Friend Awards and a Youth Action Award from Young NTUC. So without further ado, let's get on with our panel. First, can each panelist please briefly introduce yourself, the research you do, and the research you do with regards to climate change, and why climate change is important to you? Maybe we can start with Dr. Jo, because she's first on my screen.
Morning, everyone. So very happy to be here. So like what Ryan mentioned, I'm a carcinologist and I work mainly on the history and evolution of crabs and of course biogeography as well of these marine animals. So my personal interest in climate change, I think it's very important and more people should know about it because climate change has a variety of impacts, not just on the animal world, the natural world, but also on humanity itself. So in a way, climate change actually exacerbates inequality, and many effects of climate change, right? They serve to weaken society, and all the risk tends to compound itself as climate change becomes worse and worse. So one of the so actually it's all interconnected, and that is why we should be really concerned about climate change actually. So this is why I'm interested in climate change. So as far as I don't do climate change research per se, but I try to, through my classes and the young people that I teach, right, try to imprint upon them the importance of caring about this issue because I think it remains quite a far out existential threat, right? Like it's a very nebulous concept and it should be brought closer to home to many young people. And I'm glad that it's actually coming up to the forefront right now as well. Thank you very much.
Perhaps you'd like to nominate the next panelist to introduce.
Right. Okay, I'll nominate Melissa because she's just below me on my screen.
Thanks, Joelle, and thanks, Ryan, Daphne, for inviting me to join this panel and to speak with you all today on climate change. So, as Ryan introduced, I am a research fellow at the Energy Studies Institute at NUS. I've been a research fellow there, or I've been doing research there for 10 years now. Actually, 1st September was like my 10-year anniversary. So that's really long. During my time there, I try to make good with, since I've been doing research, I also pursued my master's degree, the Masters of Environmental Management, NUS, and subsequently wasn't quite ready for a PhD and then decided to do a LLM, Climate Change Law and Policy at Strathclyde, distance learning. And finally, after many requests from colleagues and my bosses, now finally starting my PhD journey, or just started this January, specializing in climate policy, transparency issues. So if the Paris Agreement essentially is the targets are nationally determined, right? Countries decide their own targets and put it forward, then the important part of the agreement to make it robust is to report progress. So that's what we mean by transparency. Why climate change is important to me, I would say, I think it's quite cliche, but we're not really saving the planet, right? We're saving ourselves as humankind because the planet will essentially, it's been around for 6.5 billion years. It will continue to exist unless the sun explodes and the solar system ceases to exist. But I think we're really here to talk about how to, govern climate change governance rather, right? So I think a lot of focus, and rightly so, should be on the science of climate change, but what comes after. So I think my interest is really in communicating the trade-offs, communicating the importance of good governance of climate change and climate action, both mitigation and adaptation, although mitigation is probably more important to my work, right? But adaptation is just as important because we live in Singapore. One experience, well, like I said, I'm happy to talk through the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and my experiences there a little later, and I can probably have a good exchange with Lastrina, as both of us have been observers to the climate negotiations. So I'll leave it as that, and maybe I can nominate somebody? Yes? Okay. Then might as well I'll nominate Lastrina, since she's not right below me, but then since I mentioned her name.
Thanks, Melissa, and thanks to Ryan, Daphne, and Conjunct Consulting for having me here today with the other panelists as well. So for myself, a bit of background, I've been volunteering in the Singapore environment sector for about 10 years now. I started off volunteering with like different groups. If you've heard of them, Eco Singapore, Ground Up Initiative. I interned previously with Eco Singapore and Green Store SG as well. And subsequently, I started off my own group, Singapore Youth for Climate Action, in 2015. And I would say in terms of the topics and areas of interest, it started off quite generic for me, but I would say along the last 5 years or so, I became more interested in climate impacts and how they impact people, especially those in the coastal regions. And I'm quite specific about the coastal regions. I would say largely because of my family's rootedness to the islands. So like my father himself, he was born on Pulau Skijang, which is now known as Lazarus Island. His parents, or rather my paternal grandfather, he was from the islands of Indonesia that's like near to Singapore. So like I've been exposed to the islands and like going out outdoors and in the sea, and I've seen how people live and how they're trying to adapt to climate impacts. Although in their terms, they don't call it climate impacts, it's just a different way of lifestyle and how they're adapting to it. And that's where I'm coming from. And I'm just trying to see how we in Singapore can, I would say, contribute to the larger Southeast Asia region and not just, doing things on Singapore and that's it. Yeah. So yeah, I'll pass it on maybe to Prof. Marvin. Yeah.
All right, thank you for the invitation, really, and thank you all for being here on a Saturday. Lastrina, I didn't know that side of your story, by the way, so thank you for sharing that. And thank you for your involvement and activism as well. Always an inspiration. I've become interested in climate change about in mid 2000s, in 2005. And one of the things that I became quite interested in initially in the realm of climate change were many of the solutions that were being put out there. So I actually became interested in things like biofuels, green energy, and all of that. But increasingly, when I started my doctoral work, I became more interested in the social science side of things. In particular, the inequalities that are associated with climate change, broadly speaking. So both the mitigation and the adaptation side of things. So so I looked into how indigenous communities were being roped in to the production of biofuels in the frontier lands in the Philippines, and how the sort of inequalities that were emerging because of that relationship. Currently, I'm doing a lot more work on, so that was kind of the impacts of the mitigation side of things. So now I'm interested in the adaptation side of things. So I've just started a project also in the Philippines looking into extreme weather events and how extreme weather events impact the food security of vulnerable populations, both in the rural and urban setting. So for me, of course, climate change is perhaps, or arguably the most important issue that we are facing today. And as Joel and Lastrina already mentioned and alluded to, there is a significant inequality aspects that we need to really take into consideration. So many of us who live in the comforts of the urban areas, for now, at least for now, right, it's just a matter of inconvenience. But for many people, it's a real thing that they experience on an everyday basis, right? It really affects their everyday lives. And as climate change becomes worse in the future, that even those of us who are just merely inconvenienced now might actually experience the full blows of it in the future, right? So so hopefully, hopefully that will be one of the things that we will be talking about today. Thank you. So I guess the only person that I have to nominate is Tai Chong. Tai Chong.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Daphne and Ryan, for the invitation. I must say that I am also not, well, I'm not researching in climate change, but I think I have deep interest in it, largely because I think the common number that seemed to have arisen is this number of 10. So Melissa and Lastrina talked about 10. So 10 years ago, I started diving. So that was a life-changing experience. I think one of the most memorable experience I had was in Thailand when we went out diving, and then the whole patch of coral reefs was just white. You know, in your mental image, right, it's like, oh, you're just going to see this colorful stuff around, but you go there, it's just a dead piece of white, and within like 10 minutes, you just want to get out of it. Just look the same, and it comes with very odd colors like fluorescent pink, orange. And that really got me thinking about what is happening to our world today. So subsequent to 2010, there were a number of other coral bleaching events. So this was very devastating because it seemed to be happening at a much more frequent rate, and the scale is going to be, seems like it's going to be worldwide soon. I think these are the issues that we are confronting today. The fact that how does this affect people? How does that affect the animals that live in the sea, the spaces that we co-share with this biodiversity? So I think where I'm coming from here is climate change is a personal interest. I think I've started off working with marine biology and then starting moving on to more conservation related issues, working with different groups of people. And you start to see that climate change together with any other contemporary issues such as sustainability is very, very complex. It really takes all hands on board. So I think this is also one of the reasons why I've been, joining different groups to see how people work together. So like, for example, there's this Climate Action SG Alliance where it gathers different groups of people, businesses, academics, and also NGOs. So you really see a lot of work going behind the scenes, something to learn from. So that's my personal interest. The second thing that I'm really passionate about here is, and really to find out a bit more of climate change and what we can do to solve, is really because I have 2 young children, right? So 2 young girls, how would our world be different? How would their world be different from ours? The challenges are going to be very different, but gradually as you get involved in this environmental scene, you start to realize that we can't go we can't go as business as usual. Some things have to change, and the change has to start now. So it's something that we've been working very hard to convince people. There are a lot of very passionate people, beyond this panel, there's so many of them working behind the scenes. So the key thing here is how do we then bring people together and we move forward. So for me, the pandemic is a, quick reset button. And this is something that we can rethink different processes, how we can do things better. And this is an opportunity to do so.
Okay. Thank you, the panelists, for all your introduction. I think previously Dr. Joel and Prof. Marvin talked a little bit about the inequality aspect that climate change brings. Perhaps can one of you elaborate on how this manifests, how climate change manifests itself in or impacts inequality?
Yeah, I'll just give one example, right? So right now, it's just unpredictable weather patterns, for example, which will potentially affect agriculture, harvest, so on and so forth. So for many agrarian countries, so this aspect alone will impact many communities, and this will directly result in, for example, increased food prices, right? So when you have, So it's all right for us because we live in Singapore. Most of us have a decent level of amount of disposable income. But imagine if global food prices have gone up to such a point where it is actually taking up a significant chunk of the daily wage of somebody living in a relatively poor community. So the increase in food prices, right, is as a total percentage of the discretionary spending of somebody living in the first world. It's actually going to be very different from somebody living in a rural community in perhaps India, and so on and so forth. So this is what happens, right? So the increase in food prices affect different people differently. And this has actually resulted in food wars. I mean, it has happened before where rising food prices have caused people to riot, especially in the poorer communities. And it's actually, you can attribute it to it as a result of climate change as well. Yeah, so I think I'll just give one example. I'm sure Marvin has a few more to contribute, right? So I'll just talk about the food in terms of food security. So Marvin, over to you.
Right, thanks, Joel. That was actually nicely put. I'm not sure if I can contribute anything anymore in terms of the food. But yeah, that's true. I mean, in terms of the food, because that's where I specialize, really, in certain populations, just think about it. For many agrarian countries, and I'm speaking mostly of agrarian countries in Southeast Asia, and many of the nations in Southeast Asia are still kind of considered agrarian countries, right? Agrarian populations can still be just about 50% or above that, slightly above that. But if we're thinking about those who belong to within the poverty line or under the poverty line, however that is defined in the development world, you would easily see people kind of populations ranging from between 50 to 70% for some of these nations, right? And when we're talking about populations that are within the poverty line, these are the same people who are vulnerable when it comes to food security, right? So again, a lot of them are dependent on their production, either as a form of subsistence, meaning that they grow most of the food for their own consumption, or they sell it so that they get some income to buy food. So there's a lot of impacts on the food production side of things, right? The most that are impacted as of now are the ones living in the kind of the higher elevations. So we see this in the upland areas and the highlands, where there is more drastic changes in weather patterns. So going from very wet seasons to more prolonged droughts, right? And many of these farmers have depended on their traditional forms of knowledge in the past to know what sort of crops to grow, how they're going to grow these crops. And now some of these traditional forms of knowledge are no longer effective. So that's one of the issues. But of course, it's not just about the rural population. So the urban population is heavily affected as well. And Lestrina actually mentioned this a while ago, those who are living in the coastal areas. Think about big cities and communities and vulnerable populations. Most of them, again, are below the poverty line, residing in the coastal areas of the cities. And we see this a lot in many of the metropolises in Southeast Asia, in Manila, in Indonesia. I mean, Jakarta is already a huge issue, right? And that's the reason why they're thinking of moving the capital elsewhere, because we're talking about issues of flooding, issues of sea level rise, whether it's actually slow impact, right? But there are variations, and actually people are already beginning to feel these variations. There are particular communities in the Philippines where they get inundated by floods on an increasing basis these days. And for most of us, we could easily adopt, right? We could easily move elsewhere. But for many of the communities, that might not be an option, right? Or if you go for that option, it entails a lot of resources. It entails a lot of, many communities simply cannot just move, right? So that's part of the inequality aspects as well. So it's impacting both the rural and the urban areas. Yeah, that's all.
So for those who are interested, right, there's this very interesting video that you can find on YouTube. Just Google Kiribati, Kiribati. So it's a very short documentary, and it really illustrates to you the very real impacts on climate change, on social issues. In one of the images, or one of the few scenes, right, you realize that the rich will be able to build seawalls, like, the huge breakwaters that protect the coast, using cement and all that. So that's usually done by private landowners. So that is a bit more longer lasting. But on the other hand, right, you realize that usually the lower income will resort to whatever they can find. Right, so they'll spend like say 50% of the time going out to the reef and collecting coral rocks and bringing back. So and building their walls. But this structure, it's very unstable. So if you can think of it in terms of the amount of time that you commit, right? So technically 50% of the time spent for somebody from the lower income used to build this wall. And because it's recurrent, you have to keep repairing it. There are two impacts. Number one, it destroys your direct livelihood because largely coastal villages are very dependent on fisheries. So the less coral reef you have, the less fish you have. So the second impact here is that because they spend so much time in doing that, they have less time for other things, more meaningful things like spending time with family, looking for a job that's higher quality. So these are issues that they contend with. But when you flip side, right, you realize that on the more people of higher income, you realize that they can actually have better quality. It's a one-time investment, heavy investment, yes, but at least it lasts a lot longer. But you can see this huge disparity, and over time, you realize that in that particular video, you will see that there will be one stretch of the beach where it's very nicely made with cement, and the other side is just part of permanent rocks. And this will give you a very good sense of the kind of inequality that will result as a result of climate change.
Thanks, Joel, Marvin, and Dr. Tool for sharing. I think so far we've heard about like the inequalities that comes around with various geographical locations and also income groups. I think for me, I would like to add another layer to that. It's the inequality that hits climate activists themselves. So we may not see it in Singapore, but globally last year, there were about more than 200 environmental activists who were killed while doing their work or for defending their lands, their forests, and so on, right? And out of this, more than half actually came from Colombia and Philippines. And I think in our region, aside from Philippines, we've also seen news from Indonesia, Malaysia, especially from the indigenous people who are defending their forests, their lands, and in their line of work, at the end of it, there is a high possibility of them getting killed. I think in that aspect, this is something I would say is very concerning, what's happening to the climate activists, to the environmental defenders. But also, on that note, just trying to put it into Singapore's context, I wouldn't say, because of this, we are a bit more privileged in what we are able to do. But I would say because of this, then the kind of point of view that we might want to take is that we face a very different scenario where we do not have such threats against us. And in fact, various government agencies and like private sector companies are trying to work together with various stakeholder groups. And I think it's very important for us to tap on all these relationships and leverage points and together work towards protecting the environment. I think that's a strength that Singapore has, and something that we should really take to heart and really, I would say, have that perspective that things work a bit differently in Singapore and just leverage on that.
Okay. Thank you, Melestrina. I think previously Prof. Marvin mentioned about how climate change affects crop yield. And given how Singapore imports 90% of our food, how do you think this will affect Singapore in the long run?
Right. So this is actually what we're trying to kind of research right now. that's why we're focusing on the region, because many of the sources of food that Singapore depends on is actually the region, with the exception of a few other food items. But leafy greens, for instance, are mostly from Malaysia, a significant part of that from Malaysia, and a lot coming from China as well. I mean, just looking at the leafy greens alone, right? We do have our local production, but it's quite small as compared to the number, to the amount of leafy greens, vegetables that we import, and including fruits as well. I think it will be a problem because for certain, for many countries in the region, right, there will be a lot of changes in production patterns in the next 10 or so years. We're just beginning to kind of look into this research-wise, right? But to just give you a good example, for instance, the community that we're interested in focusing on for our research is in the Philippines, and this is supposed to be kind of the capital of seafood production in the Philippines. So they actually supply to the big cities within the country, but they also export a lot to particularly Taiwan. Right? So I'm not sure where Singapore actually sources much of its seafood, but this is just an example. So you have Taipei that is heavily dependent on the seafood that's being produced in this particular province in the Philippines. And one of the things that they've recorded over the last 10 years is that the pattern of extreme weather events has been, extreme weather events have been increasing over the last 10 years. So, I mean, the frequency has slightly increased, but the severity of the impact has drastically increased. So meaning that, we're so used to in the Philippines that we would get thousands, hundreds of typhoons and over a span of a year, right? But these days we're getting more and more of the severe types of typhoons, the sort of the category 4 and 5 types, right? And this is quite disruptive as well, because farmers and fisher folks in particular have over the decades and centuries developed resilient forms of agricultural and fishing practices, and the drastic changes that have been happening in the last 10 to 20 years have impacted their ability to rebound from some of these effects, right? So on a yearly basis, they would be hit by these typhoons, but they've developed a system where they would quickly recover from these impacts, right? So in this one particular community, for instance, it's normal that they would get impacted or hit by a typhoon by maybe about 3 or 4 times in a year, right? In just a span of between June and December. More or less it's the same. It has increased slightly, but again, the severity has really increased drastically. So some of these communities they've actually realized it's becoming harder and harder for them to recover from some of these impacts. So the resilience has been affected, and that's what we're trying to kind of figure out. To what extent is their ability to recover from the impacts been impacted, and at the same time the sort of coping mechanisms that they're doing, and how they're kind of shifting their livelihoods. So now their strategy is to diversify their livelihoods as much as they can, but it's increasingly you're beginning to see members of the households, for instance, who are moving away from farming or fishing and working in the cities, for instance, or even leaving the country for work employment abroad, right? So they're beginning to kind of, their coping mechanism is essentially to widen their household livelihood as much as possible. So the question here is to what extent, that diversification of livelihood would eventually compromise the production of food products, right? And from what we've heard, the amount of seafood being exported to Taipei has gone down over the years, primarily because of there's less families being engaging in fishing, and the yields have gone down as well. So, but we're still trying to understand to what extent, the extent of the impacts in terms of the amount of food that they're actually producing, and the amount of food that they're actually exporting, and the amount of food that they're actually consuming in their within the communities and within the households.
Okay. Thanks, Prof. I think previously some of the panelists also alluded to the fact of rising sea levels. And given that Singapore is quite badly affected by rising sea levels, even PM Lee has mentioned that this is an issue and has said that Singapore will commit 100 billion to the next 100 years. How do you see this 100 billion being spent policy-wise, or are there some ways we should prioritize this spending of mitigation policies? Perhaps Melissa would like to start.
I think we have to do both, right? So mitigation, as Ryan, you correctly pointed out, is more of the reducing emissions, or in Singapore's case, reducing the rate of growth of emissions, right? So we know that Singapore has updated its climate target or climate pledge. We call it nationally determined contribution. We now aim to peak emissions at 65 million tons of CO2 equivalent by 2030. We should look forward to the 5-year mark. So 2025, this target should be updated again. So that's under the Paris Agreement. Targets need to be updated every 5 years, and they should go along with the principle of non-regression, i.e. It should not be backtracking. Okay, but clearly some countries in the context of COVID have already announced plans that they're already back. You just look at Vietnam's target that just got released. They actually regressed on their first target. So we don't know what the international community will react, how they will react to this, and whether they'll be penalized, so to speak. It's very hard to penalize somebody in the pandemic. So anyway, coming back to the question, I think particularly in Singapore, because climate change is an existential issue for us, we have to do both. We contribute a lot. You guys probably have heard the 0.11% being thrown around a lot. Singapore only contributes to 0.11% of global emissions. That's land-based emissions, right? But don't forget, there's also aviation and shipping that we contribute to. Okay, meaning to say we fill up the jet fuel in the airplanes. We also provide, we are one of the top bunker ports in the world. In fact, shipping emissions, if you calculate Singapore's contribution to bunker fuel, shipping emissions is 3 times the amount of land-based emissions, just for Singapore alone. And some of you may also be aware that Singapore hosts one of the largest petrochemical sectors in the world. That's on Jurong Island, of course. So we have to do what we can on mitigation, at least in the context of maintaining competitiveness as well as jobs and livelihoods. And you keep hearing that over and over again. Adaptation as well, very important. As you know, PM Lee last year, National Day rally speech, talked about 100 billion US, 100 billion Singapore dollars, right? I think on climate adaptation, which is essentially to protect our coastlines, soft and hard engineering methods, and so on. We currently do not know how we're going to raise that kind of money, likely through our reserves, but also through other innovative green financing solutions like bonds and things like that. But I think both are, they're both very important, if not equally important. I think the media and sometimes we don't communicate it well enough, and people do get confused about what we should do, but I think we should do both. But yeah, happy to have a conversation about if anybody has other thoughts on this as well. Any of the other panelists, that is. Basically, I don't want to hog the mic.
I think in that case, since we're on the topic of mitigation, I think Minister Chan Chun Sing talked about the energy mitigation of natural gas, solar, regional power grids, and low carbon alternatives, right, as one of the main ways that Singapore can mitigate. Can you elaborate a little bit more about that?
Yeah. Thanks again for thanks for sending me another question. But yes, Singapore electricity generation in Singapore is primarily contributed by natural gas, which the narrative around is that it is the cleanest, which it is, right? So I don't know why I'm using inverted, but it is the cleanest of all fossil fuels compared to coal and oil, but that still means it's a fossil fuel, right? And the reality is that Singapore being, without natural resources, we have to import electricity, we have to import energy for electricity generation. And one of the main issues that we face as a country is energy security. So we cannot only rely on one source or one or two sources of natural gas. So at first we used to pipe in gas from Malaysia and Indonesia, but quite recently, Singapore decided to build a liquefied natural gas terminal as well, which basically allows us to ship in from further afar and diversify our energy sources. The reason why you need a fossil fuel-based energy, generally speaking, is because of base load, right? So the economy needs to exist, right? Society needs to exist, and you need a form of energy that you can burn 24/7. Usually renewable energy cannot provide you with that sort of reliability, right? What happens when the sun doesn't shine, the wind doesn't blow? So, and given that solar is primarily the renewable energy alternative for Singapore, again, we get, being in an equatorial region, we get equal amounts of sunlight and night, right? And that poses a problem if we do not have battery storage in Singapore, which is currently still very expensive. And reliability is generally the issue lah. Yeah, and keeping in mind that we're moving towards a smart nation as well, and a lot of things are automated, and our high-end manufacturing is also gone basically 24/7 now. So if you go without baseload energy, that's problematic. One final point is that there is one kind of renewable that is baseload worthy, but it's nuclear. And I don't think we're quite prepared to go down that route at this point. Yeah.
If I may add to Melissa's point, that's great, really. And I think apart from the baseload issue is the fact that even your renewable energy is also dependent on fossil fuels, right? So there's this thing that we call energy return on investment. So meaning that for every energy that you bring out, you need energy to put in as well. So even with fossil fuels, right? So for you to be able to extract natural gas or extract oil, you need to use energy to be able to do that, right? So, in terms of drilling, the processing of the fuel, et cetera, et cetera. So even with the renewable energy as well, and something for us to think about, because of course we've always kind of championed renewable energy as the way to go, and of course it is. But I think what something that we need to include in our discussion as well is how much energy do we need to produce renewable energy on a large scale. So there's this group of scholars who focus on calculating energy return on investments, right? So like, for example, how much energy do you need to get energy out of solar energy, right? So the higher the number, the better, the more energy that you can extract from that source, right? With the least amount of energy that you put in. So just to give you an idea, just on the fossil fuel side, right? Before we used to have an energy return on investment for petroleum of about 100. So meaning that we can get 100 barrels of oil for just about 100 barrel that you put in. Okay, so that's pretty good, but we're already past that, right? Much of the EROI now for petroleum is just about, depending on where you are, it will hover around 10 to 20, or maybe up to 30. So we've already exhausted what we call the low-hanging fossil fuels. But then if we go to the renewable energy, right? Again, how much energy do we need to put in to make photovoltaic cells? To make photovoltaic cells, it takes a lot of energy to convert your sand, your silica, to make silica, to be able to make your photovoltaic cells. You need boron. You need to mine boron from elsewhere, and the mining would cost a lot of energy too. All right, so some of the things that came out from some of these studies point to, say, photovoltaic cells, for example, only has something like, I can't remember the exact figures, but no more than 3 energy return on investment. So we can only get 3 units of energy out of energy that we put in. Right? Wind energy is slightly is larger than that. I can't remember, something like maybe 1:10.
Yeah, Marvin, if I can interject here, in Singapore, there's also this added problem of over generation capacity. So we have twice the amount of generation capacity in already, meaning to say we only use, so we have 12 gigawatts of electricity generation capacity, but we only use 7 gigawatts a day maximum at the peak, right? So we call this demand peak demand. So technically, we don't even need solar in our grid. So it's like, I'll be cynical here, it's like a feel-good factor. Yeah, but then again, I mean, it's partly to do with energy security, but you're absolutely right. There's an energy penalty and resource penalty when it comes to any form of renewables.
Melissa, did they explain why we have that? I presume that there's an engineering reason.
Yes, absolutely. So with water and electricity, these are all very traditionally vertically integrated industries. So if you want to set up a country, you want to rule, right? Basically, you have to provide these basic things to people. And usually the government owns power and water at the very least. So they being government, divested, and they sold these power plants, the large power plants, to private holdings. And of course, if you're a private company, you look to profit, right? And with Singapore at the time anyway, the decision-making process was that, hey, there's actually going to be demand growth, electricity demand growth. So everybody pumped money into upgrading their turbines, and they all want market share, right? So at the moment we have excess, so everybody's running at like 50% capacity lah, right? So it's very inefficient if you ask me. So the idea should be to decommission some of the more inefficient plants, but if you ask companies to do that, they're generally not quite happy to do that, right? Because they've already put in the money, and these technologies, we call it technology lock-in. So once you put in a multi-million-dollar technology power plant, it usually lasts for about 30-40 years. So that's the difficult part of getting rid of these plants.
Thanks, Prof. Marvin and Mel, for sharing. I think for me, I would like to add on to what's been said, and especially to the point that Mel brought up earlier, that Singapore is a petrochemical hub. And I'm just taking a step back, right? And I'm looking at the Southeast Asia region as a whole. I mean, at this point in 2020, if we were to compare like 20 years ago, our energy demand has increased by 80%. And if we look forward 20 years, Southeast Asia as a region, our energy demand will double. And I'm just looking at that, right? So at the end of the day, for Southeast Asia, our energy demand will increase, and this will still need to come from somewhere. And while it's good that Singapore is able to shift to natural gas, this may not be the case for other Southeast Asian countries, right? And then when we're looking into those power plants and how they're operating and how clean they are, I think at the end of the day, we still need to have that comparative analysis. Okay, where then do we have these petrochemical hubs to then fund or to source out all these oil to other countries so that they can have electricity? I think that conversation or that thought should also come into the conversation. And for me personally, while I'm also trying to push for this message that we should be um, we should not promote ourselves as a petrochemical hub. I think for me at the personal level, I'm also acknowledging that someone has to do this. And given the options that we have now, I would still like Singapore to be in charge of that, so that in the larger picture, Southeast Asia as a whole can still have lower emission rates in the long run. Yeah.
Yeah, so the thing that Lastrina is just mentioning is called carbon leakage, right? Which is it's something that's important as well. If you think about it, we have fairly stringent environmental regulations here. And the argument that some people have made is that if these industries were to go somewhere else, it may not be as clean and efficient as we do it here. Yeah, because cost of production is actually pretty high in Singapore. So the companies have an incentive to reduce emissions and be more efficient. And on top of it, we are the only country in Southeast Asia that has a carbon price. It's very low, yes, $5 a ton, but it's something. Still adds compliance cost to companies.
So, I mean, listening to all of this, right, I would like to us to actually think a bit broader. Like, I mean, we've talked about the technology that's available, but I think what Lasrina is really putting forward here is, can we even think bigger to expand it to the rest of the world? Because climate change is not something that is just within Southeast Asia. It's not something that's just within Singapore. Singapore can be like, A-star in performance, but it needs a global push. The thing here is that what is the role of Singapore in a global context? What can we do together as a nation, together with our strategic partners, to move this forward so that we don't, I mean, yes, as we establish ourselves as a hub for energy and petrochemicals, the bigger question here is then what can we do with the rest of the world? Because if, let's say, we move too fast, I mean, we are always bound by the person who is the slowest, right? So that's the usual saying. The key thing here is that if we have governments having little on response, inconsistent policies, no matter how fast you move, you can't move in silos. We have to move together. So the thinking here is for us to consider is what is Singapore's role in this global context.
Would any panelists like to answer Dr. Toh's question?
I'm happy to, if you don't mind. So the issue here is that we need global momentum, right? And in the COVID-19 pandemic, it's quite hard to guarantee it because a lot of countries are obviously they're pushing for stimulus packages that are primarily economic in nature. And increasingly, and you hear this if you listen to foreign policy speeches that Singapore makes. More recently, we're talking about the need for multilateralism and less protectionism. And unfortunately, that's how the world seems to be going towards lately. You only need to look at the world's largest, I guess, is it still the world's largest? But the US, right? Let's say the Trump administration has officially pulled out of the Paris Agreement. It doesn't bode well for the rest of the world when they are not the largest emitter at this moment, but China is, but they still comprise something like 17% of global emissions, right? So Dr. Toh mentioned and rightly pointed out that it needs to be a global effort. We need to get the largest emitters on board as well. But it is challenging, right? Amid a crisis like that, if leadership is not willing, we of course hope that, so just to clear the air really, actually a future administration of the US, if they are so inclined, they can actually rejoin the Paris Agreement and commit again to new targets. But I'm afraid that perhaps the damage might be too severe because President Trump is actually reversing or has been reversing a lot of the Obama era targets and plans. I mean, he's putting the Environmental Protection Agency out of business, right? Which is essentially the agency in charge of clean air, clean water. So if you cannot even guarantee those things for your people, you're not even thinking about the global situation. So it's me first, right? America first. So that's very, I think for me, very worrying. That countries are very inward looking and looking at their own situation first, and maybe that is a necessary part of being a politician, or being if you run a government. I think that's perhaps necessary to think about your people. But I think as aspirations evolve, especially here in Singapore, somebody asked the question about youth, right? I think our young people and everyone actually wants to see everyone doing more, right? And I think we are past that stage of saying the responsibility of climate action is you, government, industry. I think we are also the consumers. We should also demand that supply chains become better, greener, more efficient. You try and curb excessive consumption, things like that. Because if we all pointed to everyone else, I think we're just gonna make the problem worse. So yeah, that's something that's just been on my mind also, about I mean, Singapore has certainly played its part, and I think obviously will continue like this. You may have heard the term honest broker being used, right? So Singapore tries to facilitate these international discussions, regional discussions, but I think neutrality also comes at a price, right? So, or rather, I would venture to say neutrality is also a position. So we remain neutral in part also because there are limitations as to what Singapore can contribute to in terms of mitigation, adaptation. And I think I'll be realistic here, and honest in saying that some countries also see us suspiciously, right? Like they don't consider us a leader because we have circumstances that are unlike many other places. We are an island city state, and a lot of our solutions certainly cannot, especially governance solutions, cannot be replicated anywhere else. So they're like, okay, great, good job, I clap for you. Then after that, it's like there's nothing else you can do, you know, to because the politics or the there's so much inertia, and don't forget the scale of solutions. Like we are a city scale, and many countries that have multiple scales. You don't need to look very far, right? So that's just my contribution to this. I did, Ryan, if you indulge me, actually, I really wanted to address this question that came really early, which is about what keeps us going. And I did want to address that quickly because I think a lot of us are experiencing burnout and mental health issues with regard to climate change. I think we should certainly, I mean, don't lose hope. There are a lot of us who are in this space that are happy to talk through the issues with you if you're interested. But I think you also need patience with regard to engaging the right people. But keep going, right? I think everyone can contribute in their own ways. If you're leading a group like Lastrina, maybe Las can share a bit more so how you cope in this space. But I would say just keep at it, keep reading and talking to people, start conversations that make you feel that at least you're trying to talk through your complex. And I think it's common enough that you feel very conflicted, like your professional view on things. You know that there are trade-offs, but inside you feel like, oh yeah, just really very sian about things. I think that's fine. Every one of us feels the same way. We're kind of in the same boat. So look to others for support if you're stressed about it. Yeah. Okay, cool.
Just following up from what Mel mentioned. So I think for me, for that particular question, I think I'll break it down into two parts, right, to your question. So one is what keeps me going, and the other part is how I actually manage depressing environmental news in the world. So I think to share with you what keeps me going, I'll then split it into two parts again. So what keeps me going at a personal level, just in general, I'm someone who's fearful of death, like just in general. And so I use this Excel sheet to track how many days I have left to live. And right now, I mean, I'm 31 this year, so apparently I've lived like 11,000 plus days and have about 19,000 left to go, assuming I live till 85. And so like having that visualizer helps me to see like, okay, how much work have I done in this like 31 years of life, and how much more good work do I want to do? Right? So like at that personal level, it sort of like helps me as a guiding point to motivate me to do good work. So that's one. With regards to how I manage myself and SYCA, I mean, SYCA started off as a volunteer group, and volunteer group in general, the dynamics is interesting in the sense that you have to work with different individuals who are all committed as volunteers, right? So there's no like fixed commitments, fixed schedules, and so on. And you learn how to manage relationships and expectations along the way. And I have to say, for the past 5 years, I've been blessed with teammates. I mean, we grew from about 8 people to about 30 people now, and that's a different dynamic altogether also. But I've really been blessed with teammates who understand each other and who are here in individual and different capacities as well, to see how they can contribute to climate action in Singapore. And although like as a group, we may move a bit slowly, I think because of the large size of the group this year. But you know, at the end of the day, having 1 or 2 who regularly check in with me and just update me what's going on, or like, okay, do you want to hang out and let's do this? I think that also helps with how I then am able to manage SYCA better. So to be honest, this year when the number suddenly like rose to about 30 people, I tried to restructure SYCA. I have to say I'm having a bit of a hard time restructuring. And now we're trying to figure things out, but it's not like the worst of things. And in fact, I'm enjoying the process, learning from my mistakes and learning how I can engage volunteers better. So yeah, that's part 1 of your question, right? How I'm managing myself and SYCA. Part 2 of your question on how I'm managing the depressing environmental news. So for me, in general, I try to stay off Facebook as much as I can. And that's something that I started off this year. So I have to say, before this, I'm quite active on Facebook and social media and Instagram, especially the Instagram stories. But I find myself wanting to comment on things a lot. And then when I begin to read too many news and commenting on stuff, I get very like overwhelmed in the sense of like being excited or being depressed about certain things. And then I realized that I can't really do anything about it. So how I manage the depressing news is I stay away from social media to stop myself from reading those news. But then what I also do is I start talking to people instead. Because I think talking to people one-to-one and trying to find out what they are doing becomes an inspiration point for me to learn how they are managing their life, what they are doing about climate action. And it's not just people in Singapore, right? People from all over the world. And I think for me, the past 2 months, I've also started doing some online courses. So I get to meet people from like India, and now we have some other, and I have some other countries as well that I talk to. But talking to all these people and realizing that, hey, you know, we're all facing this global depressing environmental news, but we're still here and we're still doing something about it. And so I find inspiration from those life stories, and I appreciate talking to people one-to-one more these days. Yeah.
So if I may just add also, right? So there's this thing called climate depression. So climate depression is real, and like Melissa said, people in the circle, more or less, we suffer from burnout, and and honestly, you're right, it's depressing. So what keeps me really going is that so in CAPT, where I teach, Dr. To as well, we're very fortunate to be able to teach classes about the environment, about the climate, to non-generalists. So this is what keeps me going, because if I were to, so what you might actually notice in these circles, right, civil society movements regarding climate change, if you go for these events, right, you may see the same people over and over again, right? So it becomes this, then you, at some point you feel like it's an echo chamber. How come the message is not going out? More people should know about this, but why am I seeing the same faces in the same events, right? And we're agreeing on the same thing, that it's a problem, and we give each other support, which is all well and good, but the message needs to go out. So what I've been trying to do recently is the last few years I've changed my strategy. Okay, so I make it my personal agenda to spread and educate as many as many people as possible, people who may not necessarily be knowledgeable about climate change. They might have some kind of very basic knowledge, but they will not know like how this affects me personally. So by teaching general elective modules, within CAT, right? So Dr. To and I co-teach it. And I think collectively we have about 60, 70 students in one module. And of these 70 students, maybe less than 10% are either environmental science students or life science students who would necessarily be more passionate about this. The rest are students who are doing engineering, accountancy, psychology. And so teaching them all these things, right, helps to widen the impact. Because climate change affects everyone, it shouldn't be left to the environmentalists to save the world, right? I mean, we all live on the same planet, and we all have a common, like, we have a common stake. Our skin is in a game, right? It doesn't matter, and it shouldn't be left to the green people, you know, the environmentalists, to save the world, so to speak. Everyone has a role, and you can apply it to whatever you're doing. So if you're reading engineering, right, you can apply green solutions to what you do, right? Accountancy, finance. There are lots of avenues for making an impact with regards to climate change, like what Melissa also mentioned earlier, like green financing, for example. So everyone in every capacity, whichever occupation that you're in, you have the potential to contribute. And so this is what keeps me going right now, which is to relate this to people that may not necessarily be aware of the current issues. Yeah, so this is what keeps me motivated, even though sometimes I get a bit upset about the forest fires, for example, like in Australia last year and currently in the US. But Lastrina is right, keep away from social media. You know, like it doesn't help your morale. So try to do something in real life and talk to different people. Yeah, thank you.
Social media is really such a deep rabbit hole, right? but I think I mean, thank you for sharing your your personal approaches to this. And I think we ought to, you know, just as what Joel said, right? This is eco anxiety is a real thing. Okay, I see it in my students. I see my students burn out, and some of them choosing not to do environmental work anymore. It's really that serious, to the point that we actually have a student right now who's studying eco anxiety. So I mean, that's how serious it is. And I think it's really we really ought to have more conversations about this, and to actually think about this from a programmatic and institutional sense as well. You know, like for example, thinking about how we could introduce ways to help our students and help all of us to actually cope with all of this, and find creative ways and find programmatic ways to help us with this. There are countless of possible things that we can consider out there, but I think, you know, I mean, this topic alone can be an entire panel, right? It can be an entire conversation altogether, and I think we should not just dismiss it. I mean, we should really consider it as an important problem.
So my very minor point here is that, you know, for me, I'm a person who's very task oriented. So I look at targets and then you reach, right? So you finish this, yay, you're done. So over the years, I've learned that perhaps one of the things that we should start considering as, you know, youths is basically to think about how to be more purpose driven. So think of environmentalism as a purpose, not a target. Right. So because there's always this pressure of, oh, I can't reach out to this number of people, I can't change this. But when you're purpose driven, I think it broadens your mind a little bit. Just one little example that we have. So John mentioned the module that we've been running. There's another module that we actually get that I get students to go out to look at different communities. So one of the interesting thing in Singapore is that you get a lot of community gardens, right? So the community gardens that are available, they can be very well run. In fact, many of them are very well run, and they have a very systematic system. They use a lot of concepts, you know, that most of the greenies will be very familiar with. Okay, so but for this group of communities, right, they don't see it as sustainability. They don't see it as, oh, climate change, but they do it because, you know, it's just their nature to want to do such things. It's part of life. So when you see things in this lens, right, you see all the auntie and uncles using recycled bottles. They're so innovative in gathering bits and pieces and creating wonderful structures for their work. You realize that at the end of the day, what is it in the broader scheme of things when it comes to advocacy and activism. So when I run our Singapore Reefs, I think the key thing here is that we should not be confined to just telling people, oh, we want to tell you about marine debris. We don't want to just organize X number of trips. I think one of the core purpose that we have here is we need to be purposeful in our action. So that would basically expand the scope of what you do. So whatever opportunity comes, you will jump on it and you try it out. So the sense of failure is not as great because you're not task driven, you see, because you're more purpose driven, and you know that there's a bigger purpose to what you're trying to do. So I think that is something to keep in check, keep in mind. So whichever passion that you are interested in, even beyond environmentalism, the purpose is very important. How you connect the dots, how you see yourself as an individual, what's your identity, how do you lead, how do you move forward with different initiatives. That will be shaped by your purpose. So asking yourself what's your purpose will be very useful.
Okay. I think there was a thanks to all panelists for sharing. I think we have one Q&A that's very interesting. Question is, how likely is it to have a successful cooperative geopolitical solution for climate change?
Well, so that really, I mean, under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, is supposed to be the place to discuss all of this. But of course, it's more like a circus nowadays, lah. I mean, last year alone, there were like 25,000 people that attended the Madrid conference. And really, I mean, if any of you have had the opportunity to attend, I don't know if Latrina shares this view, but it's very complicated. It's so nebulous nowadays that, you know, countries are negotiating about so many different things. They're protecting, generally speaking, they're protecting their interests more than they are they do contribute constructively as much as they are able to, given the kind of constraints they have back home, right? So you must think of countries. I would encourage you to read up on foreign policy and the way countries protect their own interests. I think, I can't remember who was the one who said it, but certainly I think I read it in Professor S. Jayakumar's book on diplomacy. He said there are no permanent friends, there are only permanent interests. So given Singapore's circumstances as a small, low-lying island city-state, right, which is concerned about existential issues, about whether we can remain relevant, whether we will survive, you know, survivalist mentality. Just think about the kind of things that we would, the kind of position we project at these meetings, right? So we want to keep borders open, we want international trade, and all of that sometimes is in contradiction to climate action, right? So there are necessary trade-offs, necessary or not necessary, depends where you stand on it. But I would say a geopolitical platform exists. I wouldn't say it's a solution. It's an interesting platform. Whether or not you believe in it, it's something that countries subscribe to, because as a small country, the UN is an important place in which Singapore gets to play out some of its diplomatic, you know, prowess, if you will, or like just to put certain points down. So the UN General Assembly is meeting very soon, right? It's usually September every year. I would pay attention, if you're interested in this, would pay attention to what speech, you know, look at the speech that it's either PM or the foreign minister, so Dr. Vivian Balakrishnan will be speaking on behalf of Singapore. And I encourage you to read it and understand where we're coming from in terms of where we want to position ourselves in the global world, the world order, so to speak. There are other interesting more regional platforms like ASEAN, of course, and other like non-FCCC type, which is the International Maritime Organization, Civil Aviation Organization. There's CBD, right, Convention on Biological Diversity. There's UNCCD, which is combating desertification. And all of this essentially are environmental related platforms. And so I would say climate change probably infiltrates all of these platforms. So there's no one place you can discuss climate change. And if you're looking for it, I don't think you'll find it. So I would say think of them as platforms, and the way countries and non-state actors like ourselves, right? So we're all non-state. We don't represent the government. We represent a non-government organization. There are interesting strategies and ways that we all use and employ to lobby. I mean, I know lobby has this very serious tone to it, but basically what we're doing is advocating for some kind of change, right? I think that's important. Keep doing it, and you can actually effect change and advocate for change at multiple levels. It's just you need to find the space or the spaces in which you feel most comfortable doing it, whether it's in research, like many of us do, right? We do research, we publish our work. It gets read by people who are important and who can make changes happen faster than us. Or you go and give a speech at the UN, like Ms. Trina, right? Which is something that I cannot, I'm very scared to do. But you know what I mean? So every one of us, we play our own role individually. And I mean, yeah, so that's my answer to that interesting question. Yeah. I don't know if anybody else, maybe Lars, if you wanted to add something.
Yeah, I wanted to add on, and thanks Mel for sharing how that can be done at the global scale. I mean, I just wanted to add on and looking at the crowd we have, because we have lots of young people here. So I was checking out the youth. So under the UN climate change process, right, like they have different constituency groups. So like the one for youths, it's called Yango. And Yango recently put out this Google form where they are inviting individuals as well as groups to register as a Yango member. So I mean, I guess the past few years, things were kind of fluid, and they've let Yango sort of like just run things as it is, and the group gets busy during the climate change conference period. But now there is a call for people to join in as individuals and groups. So I'll be sharing the link to their Google form in the Q&A box later on. I just wanted to highlight that you can be part of the global process. I guess as a first step, sign up to that mailing list, find out what's going on with the youth, with Yango, that's one. And then for the local scene, I guess there are various environmental groups, but as a one-stop portal, do check out Lepak in SG. That's where you can find a calendar listing of environmental events in Singapore. And lastly, I think I'll be sharing with you also a separate list that I have of women environmentalists in Singapore. And I think like you can just use that as a resource, or, you know, as young graduates later on going into the workforce, have a look at their profile and see what they've gone through, where they are now, and maybe connect with them.
So touching on the point of cooperation, I mean I put it in the chat group, right? I'm actually more optimistic about ASEAN as a group of nations than the world. To be honest, I think for the last couple of months and years, you've been seeing how different countries have been on a global fallout, made worse because of the pandemic. But within ASEAN, you realize, right, in the last 5 to 10 years, I would think it's been pretty stable, largely because ASEAN is built on the concept of trust, and culturally we are linked, not exactly the same, but we are linked in many ways, and also historically, largely also because the diplomats are on fairly good relations in one with another. So I've attended one of the ASEAN events, and you really see that they are very responsive. Countries will come together and put out statements and say, we'll do this. And if you go to the website through the link that I've sent, right, you realize it's ASEAN cooperation on environment, not ASEAN coercion on environment. So you realize there is a come forth with a very willing attitude. And I think that gives me quite a bit of optimism with regards to how we can move forward. If you go to the website again, you realize that it's subdivided into various segments based on habitats. There are also various initiatives that are very up to date. For example, say during the pandemic times, one of the things that is important, and the youth especially are very well connected. So within ASEAN itself, when you talk to the youth in the advocacy activism scene, you realize that they know somebody from this country. Say, oh yeah, I can connect you to there. So this is a very rich network that ASEAN is building up, and I'm really looking forward to what the youth and also the adults can move forward to in the next couple of years.
Okay, I think maybe we have time for one more last question. So what do you feel is a platform or resource that may be useful in Singapore for climate action, but is currently not available? perhaps something that exists in the region, in ASEAN, or even overseas in Europe? Yeah.
I feel like this is probably like, you know, previously MUA or NEA focus group discussions, right? Then they ask you, what is it that environmental groups in Singapore need and how can we address that?
They still ask this question, by the way.
Still ask. No, I guess so for me, I'm just basing it off my experience running SYCA for the past well, not just running SYCA, right, but like volunteer groups in general. I think what we need, and just broadly categorizing it into two items. One is the space to meet. I know technically we can use spaces like Redbox, and there's some other venues that you can use for free as well. But I think like having a hub like what we have, you know, for some of the social enterprises that we have in Singapore, like having a hub for environmental groups would help in fostering that collaboration and networking spaces that we would want to have, and would probably make things more convenient when we're brainstorming and having discussions. I mean, all these things are happening online, and I'm just talking like assuming there's no COVID lah. But you know, a lot of these things are happening online. It's just that I find myself, and I think others are also realizing this, but we are working in silos. And I feel having that common platform or space to meet would be very helpful. So that's one item. The other item is I feel we need like a pool of experts or technical experts that we can tap on. And the kind of experts I'm thinking about are things like your volunteer managers, your branding experts, your community catalyzers. Although that's it, technically agencies like NEA, NVPC, NYC do have teams and individuals who are looking into these things, and they are working with various sectors to see how they can support those various sectors. I'm just thinking in terms of like the general environmental groups, right? For example, if let's say 5 social enterprises in Singapore wants to have maybe financial audit, then knowing that one person who can help them do their audits, maybe then everyone can pull in money and just pay that one person, for example. Or if 5 groups plan to organize separate events in 2021, then perhaps knowing one event manager who can help them coordinate all these event logistics purposes would be convenient as well. So I'm just thinking of like these 2 large items that we may need support in.
Yeah, I wanted to add quickly on this. I don't think I have a suggestion for platform or resource, but I think I wanted to raise this issue of increasing polarization, which I think Lars kind of pointed out to the issue of silos, right? That we're working in silos. And I think that exacerbates the problem. I think we should try to get to middle ground as much as possible, and avoid blaming or putting the whole responsibility on the other, because we're all together in this, right? I mean, as cliche as it sounds, but I feel like the conversation I'm observing at the moment is moving more and more. I mean, the activists, which I know a lot of them also, they're moving, or they are perceived to be moving more and more left, right? And then it makes all of us look more and more moderate, because we somehow know how to communicate a balanced viewpoint. But our position, at least my position, has not changed since I started 10 years ago, right? So it's just that we look more and more moderate as young people get influenced more and more by what's happening globally, Greta, AOC, and the like. And I don't see that as a bad thing personally, but I do feel we should take a bit more time to evaluate what the other parties' viewpoints are, and what sort of issues they're facing as well. I don't mean to say you should be sympathetic, but try and understand and agree to disagree, right? I think we should not just point the finger and then leave it as that, and refuse to participate in discussions. I think all the more we should have more face-to-face, online, or engagements, but meaningful engagements that result in some form of action beyond it. And I think it's more of a mindset shift, not say shift, but as it's a value and mindset that you live out more than a resource or platform. Yes.
Just wanted to add to that. Great points, by the way, from Lastrina and Melissa. I think I'm thinking more of a for somebody who is in the education field. I'm not so much thinking about the platform resources. I think Lastrina would be in a better position to recommend for that. But I think in terms of what we could teach, right, and what we could offer in terms of preparing the next generation, because we're always talking about the optimism of the youth and the youth kind of carrying the torch forward. We have a colleague here who talks about this thing that he refers to as teaching for turbulence, right? And we are going to live in a world where it's going to be more turbulent in the future and even more polarized, possibly, right? And Melissa is already pointing out to some of these indications in the current time, right? So I think our task, at least for those who are involved in the education sector, is to think of what's also missing in terms of what we teach. And I think one of the things, because I've been quite attentive to this, and I've been looking at the programs that are offered in the universities, for example, in Singapore and many other universities in the region, and what are the sort of educational opportunities that we could still improve on. I think certain things, like for example, kind of the ability to ask big questions, right? And to be bold in kind of exploring questions that are uncomfortable, right? Like, raising the question of growth is still very much a taboo, right? In many educational programs and institutions, may it be in secondary school or even tertiary education. So asking big questions and kind of encouraging critical thought. And when I say critical thought, it's not just about being critical of the hegemonic system, right? Because that's what we always think. It's like, if you're a critical thinker, you're always critical of capitalism, and you're always get critical about all of these big things. But having critical thought, as well as also being critical of even the environmental position, right? And that's what we kind of encourage as, we call this reflexivity, right? So that's kind of this allowing us to, and this kind of points to what Melissa was saying, allowing us to look at the other side as well, right? Being critical of ourselves and allowing us to see the other side. The other things that, more thinking about more programmatically, things that we could offer more in educational institution would be conflict management, for instance. It's going to be, in the future, it's going to be, again, a lot more turbulent. And I think we have to have the capacity, the next generation has to have the capacity to be able to manage conflicts. And surprisingly, looking at what's offered at NUS, NTU, SUTD, and SMU, I don't know. Like, I haven't seen a conflict management course yet taught at NUS, for instance. We had one course here at Yale NUS College, but it was only offered once. I haven't heard of any course like that, for example, in NTU or in SMU, right? So I think we have to kind of think harder in terms of what sort of programs and educational opportunities that we could offer to prepare our students, or most of our attendees right now are students, right? So and more students to come in the future. Yeah.
Thanks, Prof. Marvin. I think that's a great segue to conclude this panel. But just to conclude, can we have, what is one takeaway that each panelist would like our attendees to take home?
Well, maybe I can start. Yeah, I just want to reiterate the earlier point that I made, but I think just keep going, right? Keep learning and be reflective about your position, and I mean contribute where you best can. And if you are if you do get depressed about what's going on, take a break. Don't be too hard on yourself. We're all doing our best, and I mean, people in power are also doing whatever they can, I guess, to survive, right? So think about that as well. But yeah, keep learning and keep having an open mind. I think that would be my takeaway point.
My main takeaway point here, okay, I'm going to use some Singlish, okay? So climate change is everybody's tai chi, okay? So you can be in any discipline that you want, you'll still be related to your field in some point. Even, you know, your auntie, uncles, you know, it will affect you at some point. The key thing here is how to relate it, right? So that's first, and I think that is probably the most important thing to convey, especially as you graduate, you go in the working force, you will be a policymaker, you must understand the back of your mind, right? Climate change is there. Right, so that will impact. So how do you then change your policy? How do you make a difference in that particular manner? So speaking of which, I think every single one of you here, even you, so don't underestimate yourself. I always get this comment that, oh, I'm just under 21. I'm just a student. So, but you're not just a student, right? So I'm sure that there are a lot more techniques and skills and knowledge that you have that others might not have. So that put that thing into more purposeful use, and don't undermine yourself. I think that's a key thing.
So my advice is that, you know, you need to start somewhere, but you don't have to go like for the really big thing, you know, like baby steps will do. And also be cognizant of the fact that there's, you know, I think Marvin and Melissa mentioned there's a lot of polarization in the world right now. And climate change is one of the hot topics, right? So I think the key to that is to, you know, try to bridge this mutual misunderstanding. I mean, like the climate change deniers and so, or people who don't think it's a big deal, that mankind will somehow come up with an engineering solution, or it's somebody else's problem, right? So I think it's good to have a, you know, to be quite balanced about everything, and not be too extreme or hypocritical about it. Because I think, like, for example, like I think in a comment earlier, somebody asked about veganism as a solution to climate change. I mean, it's a really good idea. And I think Marvin also mentioned very rightly that we have to be respectful of cultures and, you know, not be too forceful in these positions, because we might end up being quite hypocritical. Because let's face it, I'm a hypocrite. I'm sitting in an aircon room. I have a high consumption footprint. I have a dog. You know, I travel and I eat meat, right? So, I mean, I'm not in a, even though I care about the environment, there are things that if you look at me and my lifestyle, just the very fact that I'm living in Singapore, I am inflicting a very high carbon footprint on the planet, right? So I don't think I'm in a position, or and any one of us, if, as much as we care about the environment, we're not in a position to, you know, publicly denounce or be very extreme in our approaches. You know, so I think so try to be balanced, and always, you know, I think research-based advocacy would be a way to go, right? But not be very extreme about things like that, because I think I very much like this late Swedish physician Hans Rosling's TED talk, right? In one of the talks, right, he said to his audience, like, you can't be like the most environmentally minded person in his audience has a washing machine, right? So it's not, so it's very hypocritical for all of us to sort of like stand on this high horse and care about the environment, but yet our lifestyles don't really reflect that as well. So just be careful of that as you move forward. Thank you.
So I think for me, the one takeaway would be that I want everyone to live with is to communicate with compassion. So I'm just thinking about the various examples that has happened the past week for me. And I think, yeah, in general, when you're commenting on Facebook, or when you're emailing your member of parliament, or when you're emailing SIA, for example, remember to communicate with compassion. I think we all come from different perspectives and backgrounds and understandings, but also remember to take into consideration the other person's circumstances as well, and put forward words that are compassionate, because I guess at the end of the day, we all know that we want the other party to change, but how would they change if you're going to communicate them with so much anger or negativity, right? So I think that first step is to communicate with compassion. And I think in addition to that, if you do choose to maybe introduce solutions or like introduce climate actions in the future, in the forms of like products or services or changes to spaces or changes to systems, do remember to take a human-centered design approach. I know like there are courses out there you can, you know, take for free even and to learn about these things, but I think in general, sometimes in Singapore, even when we propose certain solutions or specific climate actions, it's sometimes proposed, you know, just to state that we have done certain things or to say that, okay, we have X number of projects and that's great, but no one's really using it or no one's really like understanding the message behind it. So at the end of the day, when you like, if you do choose to propose all these solutions, remember to take a human design centered approach. Yeah, that's all from my end.
Great. Hey, there's so much pressure being the last person to talk, but I guess from me, I'm saying this more from a personal level because I've been quite, you know, talking about social media as a rabbit hole, right? So during the circuit breaker, I've been kind of heavily involved in conversations in social media about what's going on in the Philippines. It had nothing to do with climate change, but of course there is a connection to climate change, but it has to do with politics in the Philippines and how polarized it is, and how, you know, how I've, from the beginning of the circuit breaker, how I've become so kind of very negative about it in terms of how I communicate with my relatives and friends, right? In terms of their political positions back home. I think so my ending note would probably be kind of just striking that balance between you as an individual and your personal, the extent of your personal influence, and thinking about larger questions and the structure, right? And striking that balance. In terms of the personal, just thinking about what you could possibly do as an individual. You have your own networks, you have your own, you have your friends and family, right? And this has always been kind of the issue that I've thought about in the last 3 months, because my wife would always make fun of me for having these really long conversations with friends and family in Facebook about politics, right? And she at one point asked me the question, is it really worth it? Is it worth the energy and time? Of course, I've always thought about that, right? But sometimes there are wins, you know, there are many moments when it really gets frustrated. I mean, again, we live in a very polarized world, right? But sometimes you have these moments that you thought that you managed to somewhat convince a person, and that really feels so good. and for me, even if it's just one or two individuals, you know, your friends or your family members, it helps me kind of move forward in some ways, right? And I'm thinking that it hopefully it would matter in the future, right? But also at the same time, kind of being cognizant as well that if you do have the ability to move forward beyond the individual and the personal, if you have the emotional capacity to do that, and of course your material capacities as well, if you have the time to do it, you have the resources to do it, then you can also think about how you could engage larger issues, right? So engage initiatives that target structural issues. And this could be in various forms, right? This could be like joining an activist group, for instance, or at least, you know, joining some of the conversations that ask these bigger questions beyond what an individual could do. But then again, in the end, right, we also have to take care of ourselves. And we just talked about eco-anxieties a while ago, right? So you just really have to strike that balance. And if you think that you have particular capacities to do so, emotionally and materially, then advance yourself in any of these areas, right? In the realm of the personal, individual, and in the structure.
So sorry, Marvin, I just want to encourage you to continue posting. In Singapore, we have a saying that says if your Facebook quotes are quoted in any of the news media, right, Mothership and all that, you know that you made it in life. So continue to do it.
Right, yeah.
Okay, I think thank you to all the panelists for this wonderful takeaway. I think with that, we've come to the end of our panel. Thank you for both attendees and panelists for spending your Saturday afternoon with us. This discussion has been wonderful and extremely insightful. I had a lot of fun moderating it, and can you please thank our wonderful panelists for being here today? And before we end, just do remember that we have an enabler session that's happening at 1 p.m. And with that, can we thank our panelists together? And thank you for joining us today.
Thank you all. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for your great questions.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Have a nice weekend.
And pleasure being with these 5 people, really 4 people. Well,
Same
6,
here.
including Ryan and Daphne. All right, thank you.
Okay, thank
Have
you.
a restful weekend, guys.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.